Thanks everybody for joining us and welcome to the next episode in our webinar series. This month's topic is on systemic inequalities and their effect on sexual assault reporting and sexual assault service provision. I've got some guests with me today, so we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Karen McCaskill and I am the Sexual Assault Resource Coordinator with the Women's Resource Center. And with me I have Lucia.
Hi, my name is Lucia, and I'm a junior advocate for the Women's Resource Center here in Brandon, Manitoba.
And Rosabel as well.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Rosabel Sarmiento. I'm the Spanish counselor at the Women's Resource Center.
Perfect. So just a little housekeeping things that we do before all of our webinars. A quick warning that some of the content that you're about to hear might be upsetting for some folks. So please practice good self-care and step away or pause the webinar if you need to. And also we would like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory and also operates on Treaty 1 territory, which are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. So getting right into it, as usual, I always think it's good to start with some definitions. So we're just going to talk about kind of what systemic inequalities are. So systemic issues are those that are built into particular institutions that act as a part of the functioning of the system in question. So for example, many institutions have systemic inequalities such as racism or sexism and misogyny, anti-Indigenous sentiment, anti-2S LGBTQ+ sentiment, xenophobia, socioeconomic discrimination, ableism, language barriers, urban-rural divide, and of course many more that aren't listed here that are built into the way that systems operate and become a part of the way that systems function. And those are due to things like the historical kind of context and the way that the systems were created in the first place and how these things end up getting built into them. I think it's good also to kind of differentiate between systemic and systematic and equality and equity, as I hear those terms often used online in a way that's interchangeable, and that's not necessarily the case. So systemic, as we've just talked about, means that something is a component of a system, that the practice in place is part of the functioning of that system. So for example, racism is a part of many systems that exist in Canada. So for example, the health system, the justice system, all have racism built into the way that the system functions and the way that the system was built and the way that it operates. Whereas the term systematic means that something is done as part of a plan or with a method or in like a premeditated kind of way. So doing something in a systematic way is doing it in a way that is planned, that follows kind of like a script in a sense. So that's just kind of the very basic differentiation between those two terms. Lucy, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'd like to point out an example about what systemic, like an example of a system. So something systemic is a characteristic that embodies an entire system. So like the example that you just gave for the criminal justice system, that is for a system that is, for example, practicing a specific type of prejudice like racism. That is something that is encompassing an entire system. Systematic is either the behavior or the approach practicing that system, that systemic embodiment. So just like you mentioned, it's the racism that happens in the criminal justice system. It is the misogyny that happens in the criminal justice system. So the behavior of racism and the behavior of misogyny is actually the systematic method of approaching this issue.
Yeah, thanks for that. That makes it a little bit more clear, I hope, for the folks listening. And definitely we're going to talk a little bit about the health system and the justice system in a little bit as well. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, specifically related to sexual assault. But first, just to kind of differentiate also between equality and equity. So equality essentially means sameness, treating everybody the same, providing the same opportunities and supports with the aim of producing the same outcome. Whereas equity is recognizing there are situations where providing the same to all does not equal the same outcome or the same usefulness of resources. And I think the image that floats around a lot online when we talk about equality versus equity is the one where there's three people watching, I guess, a baseball game in front of a fence, and each person is given the same level of box to stand on, but because everybody's a different height, the usefulness of that box is not the same. So in order to be equitable rather than equal, removing the barrier itself is what would make it equitable rather than equal. Okay, so what causes systemic issues in the first place? And of course, this is a very complicated topic that we're just kind of condensing into something very simple and easily digestible, but essentially, in a lot of cases, biases present at the time of the creation of systems become a part of the system's operation long after the establishment of the system itself. So a couple examples. Pardon me, the racism present in society during the formation of the legal system has led to situations where people of color do not experience it in the same way as white people do. And a more specific example of that would be creation of the police. So the police in many instances were created to catch slaves who had managed to escape. So the police were created as a way to oppress people of color in the very kind of creation of the system of policing. That was kind of the basis for that. And that has not necessarily changed long after the establishment of that system. And that kind of principle of oppression of people of color is still very much ingrained in the way that policing operates now, long after the establishment of that system. So that racism that was present at the beginning of the system's operation is present long after the system has been established. And another example would be the misogyny present in society during the time when women were beginning to work outside the home, for example, persists in the ways that companies may view women and can adversely affect hiring processes. So another more specific example of that would be the phenomenon called mommy tracking in a lot of situations where women of childbearing age might not necessarily be hired for executive positions or promoted because there's this bias ingrained within the executive level that does the hiring that sees women of reproductive age as potential mothers, and in the interests of business will not necessarily promote or hire women who are childbearing age for fear that they will, take maternity leave or eventually leave for family reasons, when you can't know that just by looking at somebody. And unfortunately, when these biases are not challenged, as they often are not, it serves to perpetuate the inequality and just kind of let it fester and let it grow. And it never gets any better, unfortunately, for the people who it affects the most. So those are kind of, very broad strokes of what causes systemic issues in the first place. Of course, that's not everything, but, unfortunately, we don't have the time to talk about everything. Okay, so entrenchment of systemic issues. So we kind of talked a little bit about where they come from, why they exist in the first place, but how do they get so entrenched in the ways that the systems we have operate? How does that even happen? So we talked about how the presence of biases at the time systems are established can perpetuate systemic inequalities, and that lack of challenging those biases can also perpetuate those inequalities. But there's other ways that systemic inequalities can be perpetuated. So for example, government policy. When governments make policy without an eye to making sure they're, anti-racist, gender inclusive, decolonial, they're not alleviating existing inequalities, and they're just perpetuating the status quo of these systemic issues. And not only policymaking, but how governments allocate resources and spend their money can reinforce systemic issues. So not spending their money in ways that are meant to remove barriers can also perpetuate systemic issues. Popular discourse, for example, On the internet, the way we talk about systemic issues or even don't talk about them has a huge effect on whether or not and how these issues get perpetuated. And as well as gaps in education. So not discussing systemic issues in schools and public education campaigns can mean fewer people are aware of them and the impacts they have on society. Not talking about them in a workplace setting can influence the ways that systemic issues are perpetuated within certain systems and within certain professions. Lack of continuing education within professions can also impact that as well. Lucia?
Yeah, thank you. These are excellent examples of systematic behaviors that follow systemic issues. So all of these government policies originate systematically through a systemic behavior. Also, the popular discourse, all of these things that we are unfortunately seeing online right now, these are effects of systemic behavior. So all of these systematic approaches and systematic issues that are happening right now originate because a larger system, in this case, the government or a big institution like universities, schools, or even hospitals. So these institutions are originating these types of behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I find that the popular discourse that's happening on the internet is especially harmful for, perpetuating the systemic issues that we're seeing and kind of being a part of that systematic approach to like all of the issues as well, because the ways that we talk about things or don't talk about them has a huge effect on whether and how they get perpetuated as well. So yeah, absolutely. So now that we've talked about systemic issues and systematic issues in a way that's very general, we're going to relate it back specifically to sexual assault. So these issues that we've talked about not only affect the way that survivors interact with systems and institutions post-assault, but they can also affect the incidence of sexual assault in the first place. So the presence of systemic issues can also affect the ways that people experience the institutions that they would like to interact with or maybe considering interacting with, but it also may affect how many people are sexually assaulted in the first place, the ways that society views sexual violence and sexual assault as well. So to use one example, due to the racism, misogyny, impacts of colonialism and genocide, Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks are more than twice as likely to experience sexual assault than non-Indigenous women, girls, and gender diverse folks. And they're also less likely to be able to access services in a way that is beneficial to them as well because of the presence of these issues. So that's just one example of many of the way that systemic issues and their, systematic approach can affect survivors of sexual violence and assault in a very serious way. So for example, we've talked a little bit about the justice system so far, but related specifically to sexual assault, we know that sexual assault is the most underreported crime in Canada, and systemic issues and their systematic approaches are a huge reason for that. So for example, oftentimes the justice system is a very male-dominated environment. It relies almost completely on patriarchal concepts of society, and the ways that officers interact with the system itself reinforce that patriarchal conceptions. It reinforces that male-dominated environment to the point where survivors are encountering sexism and misogyny at every level of their interaction with the justice system. So when I say that, I'm including police, but I'm also including lawyers and I'm also including judges. And we've seen that in several high-profile instances within the justice system. So for example, there have been well-documented cases in the media of judges who are making sexist and misogynistic remarks to survivors of sexual assault. So that is the systematic way that they are perpetuating that misogyny inherent in the system. Also, we've had defense lawyers who have undertaken lines of questioning that are inherently misogynistic and inherently sexist, that also are that systematic way that they're reproducing that systemic issue of sexism and misogyny. Lucia?
Thank you. I would also like to point out that some cases, when they're analyzed by lawyers, by court, by the legal system, are usually deemed unfounded, which means that now the case, the complainant has been deemed a person that is not reliable in their testimony. So if someone's case is deemed unfounded, well, that's another barrier, because that means that the criminal justice system is not taking your complaint seriously. So that's another big barrier that prevents women from coming forward.
Absolutely. And unfounded cases are a huge problem within the Canadian justice system. So when we say sexual assault is the most underreported crime in Canada, I think the statistics are about 95 of sexual assaults go unreported. Of the 5% that are reported, only like 2 or 3% actually make it to court, and then only like 1% or less than 1% actually yield any kind of conviction or justice for the survivor. So those numbers are just infinitesimal for when you compare it to the actual numbers of sexual assaults that are taking place. And the reason that so few of them make it to court in the first place is in large part due to the unfounded sexual assaults that Lucy is mentioning. And the way that the justice system categorizes founded versus unfounded, when something is categorized as unfounded, it's not necessarily that in every case that the police or the lawyers believe that the sexual assault didn't happen, but they can't prove it well enough in a court of law. So as much as maybe the police or the lawyers might believe that what the survivor is saying is true, they won't take it to court because there's no reasonable or what they deem as reasonable belief in a conviction of, sexual assault. So that's also what makes unfounded cases so particularly disheartening for survivors, is because it's not that the system necessarily doesn't believe them, but it's the system can't do anything about it. And the system has no teeth in a lot of places, which is also, as Lucia mentioned, a huge reason why women won't even report in the first place, because they know that this happens, unfortunately. So yeah, absolutely. That's a great example. Yeah, Rosabel?
Yeah, I would like to mention other issue related to this situation is that why women don't report this kind of incidents is that religious belief, and sometimes they feel that they provoked those situations and make feel responsible because of that. So yeah, this is really complicated for many women to talk about it and report it. And yeah, this the other thing is the language barrier. Yeah, because sometimes they don't feel comfortable and safe in trying to explain the situation. And the other thing is that sometimes they said, for instance, I have no proof, I have no evidence to take to court, so I don't know what to do. So this is really complicated for women trying to survive in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many compounding factors when we're talking about sexual assault. So yeah, and the ways that the system exploits those factors as well makes it really difficult for women and other folks to come forward with sexual assault in the first place. So justice is only one part of the system, or one system that folks may be trying to access post-assault. And of course, the other big one is the healthcare system. So just like the justice system, there are systemic issues present within the healthcare system that can deter survivors from seeking the care that they need. So for example, there's a bias towards urban communities in the provision of healthcare services, meaning that many rural communities, which is something we experience quite a lot with the people that we see at the Women's Resource Center, in many rural communities, not only are there not adequate healthcare services overall, but particularly relating to sexual assault, issues of gender-based violence, there are even fewer services available to folks living in rural communities. And as Rosabel said, in the justice system, a lack of translation services available can really prevent somebody from coming forward if they're not able to find somebody who will translate for them. They may feel like they might not be understood. That is also an issue in the healthcare system with an unavailability of translation services. And there can, of course, be a real conflict with using family members for translation services, especially in situations of assault. So not having professional translators available can be a huge deterrent as well. There's also in the healthcare system a lack of specific training for medical professionals regarding the intricacies of sexual assault cases, because they're not like any other kind of assault. It's just not. And there are intricacies and things like and nuances that are present in sexual assault cases that medical professionals really need to be specifically trained on in order to provide survivors with the proper care that they're needing. And also there is the presence, of course, of racism within healthcare systems that unfortunately have also become well documented in media cases, and the presence of racism in the healthcare system actually can cause people to die. So that is something that is also a huge barrier for many survivors of sexual assault. And I think one thing that I can give as an example of how important it is for rural communities to have healthcare professionals that are specifically trained in serving survivors of sexual assault is actually an example out of New Brunswick. So New Brunswick has the SANE program, or Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program, where nurses are specifically trained to aid survivors of sexual assault when they present at healthcare centers. They're trained to provide medical care. They're trained to do the kits. They're trained to collect evidence in a way that's trauma informed and in a way that minimizes the harm to survivors. And those nurses are meant to be on call at different points throughout the day. But unfortunately, in this one particular case in New Brunswick, a survivor had presented to a healthcare center after an assault, and they were told that there was no SANE nurse available to see them, and they had to come back the next day, at a particular time when the nurse would be available. So that, of course, would be something that would be extremely traumatic for a survivor of sexual violence or sexual assault, to have to wait that long to have somebody be able to see them. And they were told, of course, don't wash, don't change your clothes, basically just sit as you are now and just wait for somebody to be available. So that is an example of how having a lack of specifically trained healthcare professionals, and in this case it was also in a rural setting, can be extremely damaging for survivors of sexual violence. And also another big sector that survivors of sexual assault may be accessing when an assault has taken place is the social services sector. So that would be things like counseling. They might need assistance finding safe housing. They might need help with food security. They might need help with childcare. All of those kinds of things are also services that survivors may be trying to access post-assault. And for many living rurally, an added barrier on top of trying to access those things is a lack of adequate internet or cell phone service, as it's often very expensive in rural areas, or the physical infrastructure just does not exist for those kinds of things. That would prevent somebody from being able to look up or call for the services they need. In a lot of cases, due to underfunding of social service agencies, there may also be costs associated with accessing some services, which would, prevent those in a lower socioeconomic place of being able to access those services. And again, social service organizations are notoriously underfunded. Governments do not make it their top priority to fund social service organizations. And as a result of that, it affects the ability of such organizations to offer all of the services and programs that are needed in their community. So the way that, systemic issues affect the social service provision is there's a lack of low barrier services. There's a lack of services overall. There's a lack of kind of complementary services that would aid in having survivors be able to access social services. So for example, somebody can't access counseling if there's no childcare for them. They can't access counseling if they don't have phone or internet services to book the appointment. They can't access counseling if they don't have safe housing. So all of those kinds of things kind of compound and affect whether somebody is able to access social services. And again, that is also compounded by the lack of funding that is afforded to social service organizations.
Sometimes happen as well that some women, there are sometimes no money, no transportation, because they are very dependent from their partner. So they are very isolated, and they don't have the opportunity to move to another place because there's no money, no transportation, language skills is not good. So sometimes it's very complicated for women trying to get access and ask for help because of that.
Yeah, definitely. And in rural situations like what we experience in our corner of Manitoba, public transportation is a real problem. Affordable transportation is a real problem. So if a woman is living rurally and she's needing assistance, she might be reliant on the car, the family car, and she might not have access to that car. So finding either a ride into the city to her appointments or trying to get transportation to childcare could be a real issue and could affect whether or not she's able to access the services that she would need. So yeah, that's a really good point as well. Okay, so if anybody has anything else they'd like to add as a kind of an ending to our webinar, we have come to the end of our programming. Lucia, Rosabel, do you guys have anything that you'd like to add as kind of like a little closer?
So maybe we'd like to chip in as immigrant women, like what we've experienced here. I am an immigrant. I am from Mexico. So I think that something, just like Rosabel mentioned, I think a big barrier specifically for immigrant women when trying to report or trying to navigate certain institutions in another country is definitely the language barrier. So I find that the language barrier can be very challenging to navigate in certain systems, and specifically, as you mentioned, Kara, in rural zones where you may not have a center that will be able to provide you with access to a translator. So imagine a newcomer, a woman who is a newcomer to Canada who has basic English, and unfortunately she is victim of a crime, of a sexual assault crime. And number one, she faces the first barrier, which is the criminal justice system that is systematically profiling her as guilty of her own assault. Because this happens. We know this is part of the criminal justice system here in Canada. Number two, she has no translator that helps her, or an advocate that helps her navigate the criminal justice system once she starts with her procedure. And number three, maybe they do not have adequate representation, legal representation, or even medical care post-sexual assault. So these are all barriers that immigrant women may face. And finally, what Rosabel mentioned a couple of minutes ago, which is the culture. Because sometimes, depending on where you come from, your culture will deem you as guilty of being the victim of this assault. So I think that the barriers for immigrant women are a bit different. And it's very shocking that these things are still happening.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to kind of tie together everything we've talked about with the barriers in health and justice and social services, and the way that it all affects, you know, somebody who bears the brunt of all of these issues that are present in the systems that we have.
I will also like to mention that sometimes the abusers are at home, and women are afraid to be involved in, this CFS, and they usually mention that they're afraid that their kids are apprehended because they are not good mothers. They're not good mothers for them. So sometimes they think that if they report something, probably that cause that they will be, deported. So that is really complicated for women to express openly what's going on. Sometimes this situation happen at home, and for some women, it's a situation that is natural because they are their partners. So no, it's not good. It's absolutely unacceptable, and sometimes the language barrier complicate the situation to report. And as a immigrant, because I'm originally from Colombia, my first language is Spanish, and I understand how frustrating maybe to not the opportunity to express all what I want to say. And I know that some women are able to speak English, but not in the fluent way. So they feel that they're not that they don't have the opportunity to express everything what they have to do or what they want to express, and feel that okay, I want to say this, but people don't give me time to express. I need time, please, empathy, a little bit. So this is complicated, and sometimes in this situation at the institution is okay, talk about it, please, okay, go ahead. No, this is really traumatic and very stressful, and obviously it's really shameful. So process all the things at the same time is really complicated. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I think the trope of the perfect victim that exists within the justice system has that extra layer of compounded for newcomer women or women who English is not their first language. As Rosabel mentioned, it's especially traumatic in situations like that, where you feel like you're being rushed, where you feel like you're not being understood, where you feel like you're not being given the proper amount of time. So yeah, those harmful tropes that already exist have those extra layers for newcomer women as well. Yeah. All right, so we've reached the end of our programming for today. And as always, we'd like to leave you with our contact information. We can be reached by phone, by email. If you want to pop by the center, our address is listed here as well. And my information, as well as the Sexual Assault Resource Coordinator, is listed. And we'd, of course, be more than happy to answer any questions that anybody may have or inquiries that anybody may have. And yeah, we'd just like to say thanks for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon.